So the next actual action I would say are those paragraphs where we just have the truck appear. I mean, here you could almost say there's two actions here, but let's just say broadly. We'll say Jake appears, Jake's truck. Let's even just say Jake's truck flies off the road. Then is another 2 paragraphs below that is Mike running down the valley to the body to take the money. All right, the next step after that is at the top of 275, and it's Mike goes into the woods and buries the gun. Right? Another act. And then the step after that is actually the longest, in a way, the largest one. If you look at like on 275, those next 3 paragraphs of him lost in the woods, and he didn't know that if you just make 2 lines line up and blah blah blah, can just be summarized as Mike wandered in the woods. And then the last action of this, last broad action of this, Mike falls. Right, and that's basically, let's say Mike falls and is trapped. Okay, so that's your story on the level of purely the present moment, the present actions. And what's nice about doing this, I find, is it also lets you see gaps in logic in your storytelling. Right? So, like if we had here, Mike finds his spot in the woods. Mike goes to the body and takes the money. If that's what you had in your draft, obviously you can go back and go, all right, I gotta get Jake killed, so his body can be there, right? And I can't stress enough, because when you're in the flow of what you're creating, it's very easy to just, I find I leapfrog to the points in the story that I'm actually interested in. But sometimes there are aspects in between those two of logic that just are required, that are just requirements to keep the reader going with you. And so you stop every once in a while, just give a little of that as well. And it allows you to, and by doing it this way, it allows you to see, oh, where are the actual just holes, that I need to fill with something. And it may not be that you may decide you don't want to fill it with a plot, but you decide to fill it with something else. That's okay, but you know that that's missing, essentially. Yeah. And the other value of doing this is there's a lot of stuff in here. So this story, while a short story, is much too long to just convey this. Right? I mean, this could be done in about 6, 7 paragraphs, really. So, but once you have that sort of laid out like this grid, then the nice thing is you can also start saying, what can I then add to this story beyond the plot, if you're interested in the plot? And here, I would say that that's where you start getting into things like the intrigue hidden in the backstory. So, if you think about the story, you go back and read the story again, the true hero, I believe, of this story is Dolly. Because Dolly, if you think about it, comes out of this with, she now owns the business, the business that her husband Jake had, and she's gotten rid of what seemed like 2 lumps of male companionship. So, and the gun has been buried, and she never got her fingerprints on it. She got her 2 enemies, in a sense, killed off. She goes off with the business. I mean, Dolly comes, and she never even had to pick up a weapon. She didn't even have to show up in the present tense of the story. And she ruled the story. You know what I mean? That's the kind of thing that we start to say, okay, that's something I want to add into the backstory. So that you just, like, this is the nice thing on the bottom of 274, the moment we say, now came the bright part of Mike's plan. It was really Dolly's idea. And the reader goes, aha, I know what the brains in this operation is. And it ain't him. And then the second step of that I don't know that it's actually there, but I always enjoy sort of interpreting it this way. If Dolly was smart enough to tell him to do that, Dolly, I like to believe, was smart enough to also know that a person will get lost if they don't line themselves up in the woods with 2 objects. And so maybe, conceivably, Dolly even sent his ass out there to die. You know what I mean? She just kept, like, don't drink the radiated water. You know what I mean? And then he's off. Sorry, that was a bad joke. So you can start filling in things like backstory intrigue. The other thing you can start doing when you have your grid this nicely put together is This is absolutely a crime story. It's out of a book called, it's on there, I think. Well, let me get it. Okay, sorry. So it's from a book full of crime stories, an anthology of crime stories. But one of the things I also love about this is how much more sophisticated this story is than, I think, an initial dismissal of like, oh, it's a crime story would suggest. So we have the ways that the plot works well. We have this idea of like in the backstory we maybe learn something about Dolly. But another thing that this story does that I find is actually harder and harder to get people to think about doing these days is it has a really opinionated third-person omniscient narrative. And these days, one of the things that we've come to believe is that a third-person omniscient narrator is supposed to be distant, it's supposed to take no sides, right? That's supposed to be the omniscient narrator. And then sometimes also people will say it's like the godlike point of view. And a joke I like to make about that is if you think about the gods of any faith you've ever heard of, when do they not take sides? They always take sides. They have favorites. That's the reason that people have different myths and faiths, is because everybody needs their own god. To say like, well, it turns out we're perfect, is essentially what every myth is telling us. Right? Every origin myth is we're the best. Right? God didn't get it right, so he got to us or her, whatever. But here we have like these throwaway lines that I feel like in my first reading I almost just gloss over them. But like this held his hand in an odd beckoning gesture, which was lost upon the unimaginative light. And the idea of just having a third person there would be like, yeah, he's not that imaginative. You know what I mean? But then later just say, but he's also bright. Right? So, but I like that. It's that idea like intelligence and imagination are not necessarily the same thing. You know, I mean, like he's just whatever. I mean, not to go off on that, the minutiae of that point, which I find endlessly fascinating, but just to say to you as like a side note, when you think of who your third-person narrator is, it's just you, right? Like we've come to believe it's either a repertorial point of view, which is then the pretense that a reporter is not a human being, who brings their own ideas, biases, interests to any piece of work that they do, or we think we're Henry James. Right? I feel like sometimes there's this weird way I'll meet people, they write, I get a story from them and it's like, he walked into the room and found the jar atop the dresser. And within the dresser, he wondered at its contents. And then I meet the person and they're just like, hey, how you doing? What's going on? And I say, I don't understand why you're using that voice when you are not good at that voice. Because it is not your voice. And the thing that's worth remembering is, a lot of times we say like Henry James, just to use this very broad example of Henry James. But in some weird way, we've come to, I believe, some will come to believe, oh no, that's the sound of like a real serious third person writer. Right? But it's not, it's just one stuffy dude. Who was great. I mean, the Aspirin Papers is an amazing novella. But, Aspirin Papers? Anyway, but it's just him. So when you're sitting down to write, if you choose to use third person, just tell yourself, it's just me. How would I tell this story to someone? So if you have slang that you use, jokes that you tell, rhythms that you use like nobody else can copy those. So don't try to write copying someone else's, like 4 generations copy of Henry James and everybody sounds like a bad copy. So why not do yourself the service of sounding like you as a third person? You'd be amazed by how much better and more charming you are than your idea of what third person is. I promise all of you are much more charming than that. Because it's not a real... Anyway, all right, enough of that. So that's this really plot-driven story that has really, really step-by-step points. Next, I'd like to use this very short story by Amy Hempel that is almost the complete opposite, just so we can look at the ways that we can do something else entirely. So this is called San Francisco. Okay. So we'll read this fast and then. Okay. So this is very short. San Francisco. Do you know what I think? I think it was the tremors. That's what must have done it. The way the floor rolled like bongo boards under our feet. Remember it was you and Daddy and me having lunch? I guess that's not an earthquake, you said. I guess you're shaking the table. That's when it must have happened. A watch on a dresser, a small thing like that. It must have been shaken right off onto the floor. And how would Mady know? Mady at the doctor's office, all those years on a psychiatrist's couch, and suddenly the couch is moving? Good God, she's on that couch when the big one hits. Mady didn't tell you, but you know what her doctor said when she sprang from the couch and said, "My God, was that an earthquake?" The doctor said this, "Did it feel like an earthquake to you?" I think we are agreed you have to look on the light side. So that's when I think it must have happened. Not that it matters to me. Mady is the one who wants to know. She thinks she has it coming, being the older daughter. Although, where was the older daughter when it happened? Which daughter was it that found you? When Mady started asking about your watch, I felt I had to say it. I said, with the body barely cold. Mady said the body is not the person, that the essence is the person, and that the essence leaves the body behind it, along with the body's possessions. For example, its watch. Time flies, I said, like an arrow. Fruit flies, I said, and Mady said, what? Fruit flies, I said again. Fruit flies like a banana. That's how easy it is to play a joke on Mady. Remember how easy? Now Mady thinks I took your watch. She thinks because I got there first, my first thought was to take it. Mady keeps asking, who took Mama's watch? She says, did you take Mama's watch? Okay. So oftentimes I'll read this story twice for the class because it is absolutely a dense story and like tricking out what, forget even like what happens, just tricking out who's in it and what they're actually saying is a great deal of like really it's work that will pay off because it is all there purposefully buried. But since we don't have that, I figure I just dive in, right? So the first thing that's worth pointing out is that the mother doesn't die in the earthquake. That's the first thing that seems like there's an earthquake, it's called San Francisco, and the mother's dead. You assume that those two things are tied. But we see here the earthquake happens and the mother speaks to her afterward. So at the very, even if she died subsequently because of the earthquake, she didn't die in the earthquake. So we just take that as for granted. So this is not a story about that, right? This is a story about a woman who is appealing to her dead mom to essentially adjudicate with her other sister. And while the watch is the thing that they are discussing, I think it's pretty clear the watch is not actually what's important. What's important, on some level, what's important is there's one sister who is willing to discuss the remains of essentially a dead body. And then there's another sister who is still speaking to the being who died. Right? And so in that way you have one character who is in the material world, and you have one character who is stuck, in a sense, in the spiritual world, in the other world, right? And the tone of this entire piece, this very short piece, is this narrator appealing to her mother, right? That's all this entire piece. I mean, if we get to that last, if you read it through again on your own, when you read it through a couple times, when you get to just about almost the last, the line just before the last paragraph, that's how easy it is to play a joke on me. Remember how easy, and it's a plea, like please somebody, because while Mady has in a sense moved on, some people read, the nice thing about the story is you can read it in various ways. Some people, when they get to the end, completely side with Mady and say she's the same, safe one, healthy one, she's gone through therapy, she's separated herself from this clearly like cloying type family, and then there's people who come to the end and just say Mady's awful, and she's bought into this quack science, and the daughter who's the narrator is just a loving and a loving daughter who has maintained close ties to her mother. It is not. I'm not trying to argue that you can have whatever interpretation you want, but what matters is the state of this narrator at the end of the story, right? So when we get to the end of this story, you don't know what she's doing, what her job is, where she's living, what this moment is. But I would argue that so this entire story is just the one box, right? Because we have no other plot to it or anything. But what I would argue is, we just write something in it. I mean, whatever you say. That says, the chicken scratch says, the narrator is paralyzed emotionally. This is a person who cannot move beyond the loss she's experienced. And so, because Hempel has purposefully made this the case, you can infer, you can understand whatever she's doing. If she's at her job, if she is taking care of, if she has children of her own, whatever she's doing, this is where she is. This is her present condition. And she cannot get out of it, right? And so when you're writing a piece that, if you're not particularly interested in plot-driven this or that, or anything like that, that's not the same as saying, therefore I'm free from the necessity to think about the present state of my character. In fact, if you don't have a plot, it's even more important. If you don't have movement, action of some kind, it's even more important that you think about why is it that this character isn't actually moving? Why am I refusing to give any details like that? And I don't know about you, but like when I read this story, I can absolutely understand the way that living in grief or pain can feel as though there is no present life. Nothing is happening except my pain, right? But of course, knowing that that's the case isn't to say that's how life can feel sometimes, but that's not actually true, right? You probably still have to get up at least to go to the bathroom, yeah? You still have to do something. So as an author, you're thinking, you have to say to yourself, why am I refusing to do that? What is the larger point of not giving anything about the present? And in this Hempel story, I would argue it's because the point is none of that matters. Because this is the life that she's stuck in, is the loss of this mother. And you can imagine no matter where she is, no matter what she's doing, all she's actually doing is appealing to her mother for contact, for a return of the bond that she lost. Yeah. Okay, and so and sort of wrapping this up a little bit, the reason I would urge you to try doing this, no matter what kind of stories you're working on, is because the point, I would argue that the point of writing is to serve the story, not to serve yourself, and to serve the reader. Again, not to serve yourself. The early drafts are often to serve yourself, right? You're just getting things out, you're working through ideas, working through feelings. But at a certain point, it can no longer feel new and fresh to you. It starts to become an issue of just technical questions. When do I put this before that? How do I describe this better? You know, it's like musicians who say, like, if they have long careers, you say, like, I remember reading something from, what's his name? The Rolling Stones, Keith Richards, where he says, they said, do you actually enjoy playing any of these songs anymore? These songs from 30, 40 years ago? And he said, I know exactly what every movement and chord will do to this crowd, and when it does it to them for the first time, it renews the joy for me. And at a certain point in the draft writing process, you have to give up the feeling of, I'm just enjoying writing all these things. It's an experience of, because if it feels like that all the way up to the point where you're trying to publish this book or story, then just publish it at home. Because you're only still written for you. If you actually want to share it with other people, then think of other people. Right? I mean, it's a hard thing to do because you're writing something that is your personal expression. But after a while, you gotta stop. You know, and then you start being a technician, a person with craft work. And there's my wrap up, sort of tie in the word and all kind of thing. And then if you do this again and again, I just want to reiterate the point. My point is not to say jam in lots of action. My point is only to say always know what actions you are to do, and be ruthless with yourself if you do these boxes with what those actions are. Summarize. The character makes coffee. That's the scene, not all those little steps and all the thoughts the character has. This is the coffee mug of my father. This was the coffee grinder of my mother. Those are not actions. They're beautiful, they can be great, but they're not actions. And so you just want to be ruthless with each other so that you can see that. And in the end, I mean, I hope that these small little tricks can be helpful for you, no matter what kind of stories you want to write. That's all I got. Right? So, thank you for listening to that. Yeah, you can clap.